The chase started off with me missing this first train, CSX M453, here at the big crossing at Lake Panasoffkee. Soon, M453 would trigger the defect detector north of Bushnell at milepost 771.3.
CSX detector, milepost 771.3.
Once this long cut of autoracks finally cleared me here, I'd move about a mile or two south to start the chase of this B24108 coming southbound from Wildwood with all Canadian national power. A few minutes later, I'd arrive at this random private crossing I found on Google Maps, which is right off of County Road 475, that seemingly goes to nothing. And after waiting for about 5 minutes, I'd finally see the head end of CSX train B24108 with CN locomotive 2953 in the lead, sporting an Every Child Matters sticker on the nose, one of only two that they have with that same sticker. With the nose of B241 approaching me here at Panasoffkee, the chase would finally begin. So, let's go. Once his engines passed me here, I'd get on the road, plainly seeing and hearing him through the trees as I made my way towards Bushnell. The next stop to see him would be next to Old Airport Road, just north of downtown Bushnell, where he'd be slowing down on the main line to meet two incoming northbound trains who would pass him in the Bushnell siding off to the right. I'd move south to the south end of the Bushnell siding in downtown Bushnell to wait on the two incoming northbounds. First up in about 5 minutes would be CSX train B24011, the northbound counterpart to the B241 sitting here in the siding. This B240 would be a pretty pleasant surprise, also sporting CN power, with two ET44s and an ES44, making for a wonderful Canadian meet here in the Bushnell siding. Yes, sir.
Marker hanging there, fellas. Y'all be careful out there. I'm still looking at the tanks up in there. You guys are good as well, I would think.
The northbound that conductor was telling me about would be CSX EO40, empty coal train out of Stanton's power plant in Orlando up to Oaktown, Indiana. I'd quickly hop in the truck and get a move on ahead of the B-241 as he'd start to leave the siding, catching him at the Welcome to Bushnell sign off US 301, south of downtown, a shot I've wanted to get for a very long time. I'd then hop back in the truck and make my way south on US 301 to Dade City, but not before doing some pacing along the way, which is probably some of my favorite pacing I've done this whole year. I'd speed ahead of the B-241 to stop at St. Catherine to get this quick shot of him moving at pretty high speed, almost 60 miles an hour. I would then keep pushing south to Dade City, going to the Heritage Museum instead of Owensboro Road like I usually do. With some recent construction now finished on the old Lakeland Highway, the road that parallels the museum and the S-Line right here, you're actually able to drive straight down Old Lakeland Highway south to the museum, instead of what you'd have to do previously a few months ago, going through downtown Dade City on the old US 98 and cutting across on State Road 52, which would take a lot of time with some traffic. But with about a minute or two to spare, I'd get my last glimpse of B-241 here at the Heritage Museum, and finally get to see his full train, about 620 axles. I was initially going to go back home after this B241 here in Dade City, but since I had no plans the rest of the day, I decided to stay out here for another few hours and see what I'd see. Next up, meeting B241 at Vitus Junction would be CSX M604, daily manifest from Winston Yard up to Waycross, Georgia, who was massive today, being over 800 axles, 818 to be exact, which is pretty big for 604. After M604, I'd get some food and wait around for the next few hours for my next southbound to show up, which would be CSX L743, a southbound local job from Brown Sand, Georgia on the Fitzgerald sub, down in the Winston Yard in Lakeland. He'd be about 400 axles today and would definitely be flying. I set up on the back porch of the museum, which faces right next to the tracks. And I was handheld for this train because I knew from past experience that trains love to shake the platform here, and with a train like 743, he definitely shook the place and was definitely pretty loud moving at speed. The wait after L743 would be a pretty long and boring one, with nothing showing up until almost 8:30 p.m. But that train that did finally show up would have some pretty interesting power and would definitely be worth the wait. My last train for the evening was CSX I-044, northbound intermodal from Tampa's Usteeda Yard to Jacksonville's Duval Yard. Usually, I-044 only runs with one locomotive, but today he'd run with three, taking the power from an earlier B621 that went to Tampa that had a CSX Gevo and two Norfolk Southern units trailing, the middle one being an ST-70 Ace numbered 1111, commonly referred to as the barcode unit, and NS-4717, a GE AC-44 C6M, an AC-44 rebuild. It's rare to see foreign power on I-044, let alone three locomotives, since he's usually only long enough to need one or maybe two on a good day. So, with the familiar sound of a Nathan K5HL in the distance, I'd soon see train I-04412 with three locomotives on the head end, being CSX and two NS, passing me here at the Dade City Heritage Museum. A pretty fantastic way to end the pretty great day of rail fitting here on the CSX S line.